This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support my channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought.
The first important thing you can do is to be sure you know what communism really is. In other words, know your enemy. Whoever you are, wherever you are, discuss the red menace with your neighbors, your friends, your business associates, your fellow students. Are you a factory worker? A member of a union, a trade association, a service club, or a church? Be alert to spot anyone promoting the communist line, and be doubly alert when the communists start hunting you. That's right. No matter who you are, you have your own circle of influence. So the commies want you. They have a variety of approaches. Any one of them may sound reasonable, even commendable. Just don't ever agree to join any committee, or support any cause, or sign any petition, or allow your name to be used in any manner until you know the whole story, who's behind it, what their real objectives are.
I feel that the millions of Americans who have long voted the Democrat ticket are just as loyal, they love America just as much, they hate communism just as much as the average Republican, which proves my contention, and that is that in this fight against communism, it isn't a Democrat fight, it isn't a Republican fight. It's so easy, you see, to talk about communism generally, to talk about the sellout in China and Korea generally. But unless you call the roll of the traitors, treason isn't like little topsy, it doesn't just grow. It's created by men with faces and men with names. And I think those of us who have been elected by the American people to man the watchtowers, unless we have the intelligence to recognize the traitors, and then, if I may use a word which we use in Wisconsin, unless we have the guts to name them, we should be taken down from those watchtowers and should not be representing the American people. And I don't intend to ever avoid giving the names of traitors, giving the names of communists, when I discover them in important position.
In last week's video, I mentioned polling that indicated only half of American young people hold a positive opinion of capitalism. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone that we're beginning to see a predictably paranoid response from the reactionary crowd. If you thought McCarthyism was a thing of the past, well, no such luck. In this episode, we're going to talk about a budding effort to enforce so-called patriotic education standards in American schools, and what that means for the nation and the world going forward. Okay, let's set the stage. This past month, Florida Governor Ron Desantis held a bill signing event where he and some others explained what exactly their program entails. I'm going to play a few clips to give you a sense of what we're dealing with, and then we'll talk about some specifics.
The bill also expands our previous efforts in civics to add a requirement for the high school government class that students receive instruction on the evils of communism and totalitarian ideologies. We have a number of people in Florida, particularly southern Florida, who've escaped totalitarian regimes, who've escaped communist dictatorships to be able to come to America. We want all students to understand the difference. Why would somebody flee across shark-infested waters, say leaving from Cuba to come to southern Florida? Why would somebody leave a place like Vietnam? Why would people leave these countries and risk their life to be able to come here? It's important that students understand that.
Okay, lots to unpack here. House Bill 5, which is one of 3 related bills, includes a requirement that high school students be taught about, quote, the evils of communism and totalitarian ideologies. DeSantis then mentions Cuba and Vietnam. Let's start with Cuba. Cuba is an island nation which has suffered under brutal US sanctions for nearly 60 years now. These sanctions have been denounced by the UN as illegal and inhumane, and every single member state, with the exception of the US and Israel, continues to vote against the oppressive measures which have cost the Cuban economy trillions of dollars. Despite this cruelty, Cuba is a country with a greater life expectancy than the US. They had a better COVID response than the US, and the basic human decency to send their doctors around the world to places that needed help, without any expectation of financial gain. Why would somebody flee across shark-infested waters to come to America? I don't know, Ron. Maybe it's because decades of illegal US embargoes are slowly strangling an innocent nation. A nation which deserves, like any other, the freedom to determine their own future. The United States will not allow that. It's no surprise that some Cubans have emigrated to the nearest country. What about Vietnam? Honestly, I'm not sure what DeSantis is talking about here. He makes it sound like there's some massive exodus from Vietnam to the US. That is not the case. The Vietnamese show overwhelming support for their government, which isn't surprising considering how effectively that government handles crises like COVID and actually takes care of their citizens. In fact, out of 45 polled nations, Vietnam reported the highest rate of satisfaction with their government's response to the coronavirus pandemic. Going back to Cuba, as more free market policies have been implemented over the years, Cuban satisfaction with their government has declined, dropping from 81% under Fidel Castro to 54% today. The US Congress, by contrast, enjoys an abysmal 26% approval rating. That is among the worst in the world, and frankly, it's not surprising. Both Democrats and Republicans have shown time and again that they don't care about the American people. They only care about their corporate donations. That's why we had the worst COVID response in the world. It's why we're the only industrialized nation not to have some form of universal healthcare. It's why our life expectancy is on the decline, why rates of depression and suicide are on the rise, and why a full half of young Americans have lost faith in capitalism entirely. And if we're talking about Americans and Vietnam, Vietnam is constantly among the top foreign retirement destinations for Americans. So there is population exchange between Vietnam and the US. It's just not in the direction DeSantis would have you believe.
Now, as part of this bill, Florida will create a Portraits and Patriotism library so students can learn about real patriots who came to this country after seeing the horrors of these communist regimes. We actually have folks here today. You'll hear from her in a minute, Anna Abauza. She came to the United States when she was a teenager, fleeing from Nicaragua when the Sandinistas brought socialism to that country.
Another part of the bill is the creation of what Florida is calling the Portraits in Patriotism library, where students can learn about people who are willing to be useful pawns to the political right and condemn left-wing politics, including one person who fled from Nicaragua when, quote, the Sandinistas brought socialism to that country. If Ron DeSantis weren't perhaps the dumbest politician currently living, I would assume this was satire. The years he's referring to are widely known as the period during which the United States funded right-wing death squads in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And it wasn't just indirect funding. The CIA also played an active and criminal role in what were called the Dirty Wars. For example, they planted mines around 3 Nicaraguan harbors, which constituted an act of state terrorism.
While the mining of Nicaraguan harbors has caused a huge political furor in the United States, anti-Sandinista guerrilla sources here in Costa Rica feel vindicated because of the tactical effectiveness of the mining. Specifically, the denial of these high-speed patrol boats and landing craft to the communist government in Nicaragua.
Thankfully, the US was convicted of violating international law at the World Court. So, when DeSantis talks about people fleeing Nicaragua when socialism came to the country, what he's leaving out is that socialism was on track to improve people's lives and counter the lie of capitalist superiority. So the United States decided to intervene and plunge the country into chaos through unspeakable violence and violations of international law. None of this is secret knowledge. You can go online right now and read about Reagan's meddling in the Global South. As always, I've left some links in the description.
Finally, I'm signing House Bill 233. The bill requires colleges and universities to conduct annual assessments on the intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity at these institutions. It used to be thought that a university campus was a place where you'd be exposed to a lot of different ideas. Unfortunately, now the norm is really these are more intellectually repressive environments. You have orthodoxies that are promoted and other viewpoints are shunned or even suppressed. We don't want that in Florida. You need to have a true contest of ideas. Students should not be shielded from ideas, and we want robust First Amendment speech on our college and university campuses. And I think that having intellectual diversity is something that's very, very important.
Okay, House Bill 233, quote, requires public colleges and universities to conduct annual assessments on the intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity at these institutions. Ron DeSantis is all about intellectual freedom, college kids having the chance to learn dissenting opinions, and freedom of speech on campus. Except, when he's actively trying to ban things like critical race theory, which isn't even taught in Florida, or an accurate history of the slave trade. Topics which don't comply with his vision of a staunchly right-wing education. Let's get one thing straight. Reactionaries like Desantis and their wealthy suburban supporters seem to believe that all colleges and universities are anti-capitalist indoctrination centers. To put it as gently as I possibly can, that is among the dumbest things I have ever heard. To my knowledge, there is not a single school in this country that doesn't allow college Republican groups or college Democrat groups. Both the Republicans and the Democrats are capitalist parties. Even the most supposedly left-wing candidates like Elizabeth Warren go out of their way to remind people that they're capitalists. You know what's often not allowed on college campuses? Socialist groups. The ideology Desantis claims is brainwashing all our students. They're often seen as extremists, and faculty don't want to risk their jobs by associating with actual left-wing ideas. For those of you who have attended college, leave in the comments if you ever met an even remotely socialist professor. I will be very surprised. In my experience, and the experience of everyone I've spoken to, capitalist economics and ideas are the norm on college campuses.
Are you a student or a teacher? Well, write to your congressman for a copy of J. Edgar Hoover's report, Communist Target Youth. See how, on direct orders from Moscow, the party is in a drive to get communist speakers into our colleges and universities, taking advantage of American academic freedom and the students' naturally inquiring minds. Their aim is to preach revolutionary tactics and change peaceful campuses into scenes like this: the communist-incited student riots in San Francisco.
The assertion that communists are brainwashing the country's college students isn't new. It's a page ripped directly from McCarthyism, and we need to understand it as such. It is part of the new Red Scare.
And we thought, what if we could do that same thing for people who fled to America, who had all the places in the world to choose to come, but they chose to come here to the United States because where they were from, freedom was a luxury and liberty was just a dream. What if we could interview those people and have young folks like those that are here today ask them questions and hear back about what it really means to live in a communist regime like that in Cuba, or to other totalitarian regimes like in Nicaragua or Venezuela. And that's what today is all about. And myself and Representative Zika, the members that are here today, gathered with the victims of communism months ago on the steps of the Capitol to make sure that we would achieve just that.
Want to know a fun fact about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation? They count people who died from COVID and literal Nazi soldiers from World War II as victims of communism. I mean, yeah, technically it was the Soviets who beat the Nazis, which is an odd thing for the foundation to admit, because people like Desantis and other American politicians love to claim it was the US that beat them. As far as COVID deaths go, the hyper-capitalist US has had the most deaths by far, and socialist and communist countries have had among the fewest. That should tell you all you need to know about the Victims of Communism Foundation. It's a disgusting, disingenuous, capitalist propaganda outlet that dishonors the memory of those it claims to remember. What this legislation hopes to achieve, besides fully rewriting actual history, is to have guest lecturers from blatantly anti-communist front groups come to schools and inject McCarthy-era Cold War rhetoric into the minds of American students, starting them on the track to become obedient, terrified little worker drones when they complete their state-mandated propaganda education. I can say I agree with Desantis on one thing. Teaching American history is critical. That's why I am so opposed to this new initiative. It doesn't teach history. It dredges up the worst aspects of the Red Scare and tries to indoctrinate children with bizarre, outdated, and flat-out false pro-America anti-communist propaganda. At the end of the day, socialists like me aren't asking for much. We think it's important to have an honest reckoning of America's role in world history, the good and the bad. We shouldn't just leave out the parts that reflect poorly on the world's most powerful nation. We should be able to confront difficult history and say, you know what? Yeah, that was wrong, and work to correct it. We should be able to soberly assess the failures of our current economic system and be willing to try new ideas. But unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon. We seem to be experiencing the first wave of extreme reaction to capitalism's decline. Its staunchest defenders circling the wagons around a fake mythos, launching actual indoctrination campaigns, and attempting to reignite the Red Scare, a period widely considered as one of the most misguided, dystopian, and un-American in history. On the bright side, this whole campaign is reminiscent of DARE, which I'm sure people my age remember from their time in school. The idea was to teach kids that drugs were literally going to kill you immediately, and that they made you a bad person. Unsurprisingly, that approach didn't work, and it got otherwise apathetic kids interested in drugs. That's just how kids are. They love to do the things grown-ups say are bad. So in this case, if we're lucky, in a few years we'll have middle schoolers in Florida handing out bootleg copies of The State and Revolution at recess. It's funny to think about, but in all seriousness, this kind of reactionary legislation is a big problem. It indicates a severe rightward shift in American politics, and I think there's more on the way. The American people need to decide what they stand for. Is it ahistorical and xenophobic fairy tales about an America that never existed? Or is it the belief that all humans are created equal? That economic ideas are meant to be challenged? And that progress does not have to be at the expense of human life and dignity? Capitalism leads us down the former road. I think we should choose the latter. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. When I decided to make the shift from general interest stuff to more radical political content, I knew I ran the risk of sinking my channel and losing my ad revenue and sponsors. These days, it's pretty hard to get a sponsor on my videos. I have one reliable one, and they're great. But for the most part, I'm having to rely on the generous support of viewers like you. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, as well as access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out, chat with other like-minded people, or learn about socialist theory in our book club. I'm also pretty active in the server, so you're always welcome to ping me to ask a question or just say hi. You can find my Patreon, join our growing Discord server, and get early access to every video at patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous videos by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.